Boleyn was clearly a doting mother to her only surviving child, Elizabeth. But Anne had become a parent before Elizabeth had been born, albeit a step-parent to the Princess Mary. Anne would have a greater impact on her stepchild than her maternal daughter, an influence which would distort the young and vulnerable Mary forever. We do not know when Anne and Mary first met each other. Certainly Anne would have been, despite being of good birth, a courtier of very little importance at the time of their meeting, and would have had little impact on the princess. Despite many myths of love at first sight, Henry was in fact slow in his advances towards Anne, and it is clear that Anne was not the cause of Henry's desire for an annulment from his once much-loved wife. Anne certainly provided a reason to pursue and hasten the annulment. However, it is clear that Henry's primary reason for the separation of his first marriage was the succession and security. Henry had openly acknowledged Mary as his successor, but I doubt that he ever believed any female capable of holding the reins of England. In the late summer of 1526, it was clear that Henry had become hopelessly infatuated with Anne, and by the spring of 1527, Henry had begun consultations regarding the possibility of an annulment from his first wife, Catherine. It was only in June of 1527 that Catherine was made fully aware of Henry's intentions. Mary, however, was shielded from the truth for some time. It is likely that her mother, or members of the household such as Margaret Pole, eventually made Mary aware of Henry's intentions. Catherine undoubtedly fought for her daughter's position as heir, but she had actually refused to relent her position when it could have saved Mary's status. In 1528, Cardinal Campeggio had suggested that Catherine should take the veil and leave Henry free to marry without calling into question the validity of Mary's right to the throne. She refused this option, ultimately condemning her daughter to illegitimate status. She defended her position amiably at the court hearing of Blackfriars in June of 1529, demanding that the court was not legitimate and pleading for her case to be held in Rome, which was indeed granted on the 23rd of July. If Anne should be described as anything, it should be an able politician. She had not been trained as a princess, but she understood the importance of politics and was able to detach herself emotionally from Catherine and Mary's position. Anne understood the importance of political factions, and instead of troubling to convert the supporters of Catherine, she built up her own faction, consisting predominantly of her own family. The fall of Wolsey after the disastrous court of Blackfriars left many vacancies for the rising Boleyn faction. Mary could hardly fail to notice the many changing faces at court, and by 1531 her declining mental health was all too apparent to the Venetian ambassador, who wrote that she had been ill for several weeks from hysteria. At the tender age of 15, Mary was suffering greatly from painful menstrual difficulties and depression, undoubtedly worsened by her uncertain position and her mother's torment. Catherine pleaded that Mary should be allowed to come to court to visit her parents in 1531, but her request was declined by Henry. It is likely that Anne too was responsible for keeping Mary away from court. Matters finally came to a head when Henry abruptly left with the court and Anne on the summer progression of that year. The Queen had always accompanied him, but she had been abandoned at Windsor. Catherine was banished to the moor, where she set up her own court, and Mary was sent to Richmond. Neither mother nor daughter comprehended that this parting would be their last. They never saw each other again. Mary did, however, see Henry for the next 2 years, much to the annoyance of Anne, who demanded that she be lodged as far away from her as possible. Anne clearly disliked and mistrusted Mary's presence, and although she had much influence on Henry at this time, it is clear that Henry himself was the root of Mary's misery, although she herself could not see it. Mary saw the rising Boleyn faction as the cause of the impending annulment, and to an extent this is true. Anne had become a patron of Cranmer and Cromwell, who skillfully organised the much-desired end to the marriage of Aragon. However, Mary failed to realise that Anne was merely providing answers to Henry's dilemma. Mary can only have looked on in horror when Anne was elevated to Marchioness of Pembroke on the 1st of September 1532, and was more than distressed when she was brought the news in April 1533 that Anne had taken her mother's place as wife to the king 3 months earlier and was to be crowned as queen. The realities of Mary's new life became obvious when in July 1533 Mary was ordered to give up her jewellery, just as her mother had. At this 10 years' time, one figure that Mary relied on was Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador. On the 7th of September, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, which had a profound effect on both Anne and Mary. Had Anne delivered a boy, her position would have been much stronger, and Mary refused to acknowledge Elizabeth as princess. She believed that Anne had destroyed her mother, and Mary had no hesitation in opposing her. Relations between Anne and Mary decidedly declined when Mary joined Elizabeth at her residence at Hatfield. On arriving, the Duke of Norfolk asked Mary if she would like to pay her respects to the Princess Elizabeth, and Mary replied that she knew of no other princess but herself. Her message to Henry was that the Princess of Wales, his daughter, asked for his blessing. When the Duke of Norfolk presented the message to Henry, he rebuked the Duke, stating that he would soon find the means of humiliating and subduing her temper, making it clear who decided her future. Anne was outraged by Mary's stubborn behaviour, and, as she often did in times of fierce anger, threatened the child with violence. She ordered that Mary's ears be boxed as a cursed bastard. However, there is no contemporary evidence to suggest that Anne's orders were carried out. Although Anne was an able politician, she was at times lacking in confidence, and often let her temper overrule her at times. When her head was cooler, she did however attempt to reason with the Lady Mary on numerous occasions. The meetings always took the same path, with Mary refusing to take Anne's bait of a reunion with her father. The meeting between Anne and Mary in March 1534 was one such occasion. Anne pleaded with Mary to acknowledge her as queen, and in turn she would appease Henry. Mary's haughty reply was that she knew no Queen of England save her mother, but if Madame Anne Boleyn would speak to her on her father's behalf, she would be much obliged. Mary's health continued to deteriorate, most probably due to the threat of the new Act of Succession that loomed above her head. Already members of her household had been questioned in the Tower regarding her status. The dramatic events of Henry's changes in the church and his new status as the head of the church in England added to Mary's already growing fears for her life. The executions of More and Fisher seem to have triggered Mary into seriously considering escaping from England, and in January of 1536, Mary lost her iconic mother, which destroyed her smouldering hopes of reconciliation, as well as plunging Mary further into depression. Anne was now the only possible Queen of England, and took full advantage of her secure position, and tried once again to improve her relations with Mary. Another refusal led Anne to writing a letter detailing how damaging Mary's actions could be, and the danger that Mary would be in, even if she took the oaths under duress. The letter, addressed to Lady Shelton, was left for Mary to read. It became clear to Mary that with her mother's death, Anne now considered Mary her main threat, and Anne's miscarriage on the 29th of January 1536 made Anne's tenuous position all too obvious. Chapuis, an obvious and devout supporter of Mary, noticed the tide turning for Anne and consulted with Cromwell in April. Cromwell had recently fallen grievously out of favour with Queen Anne regarding the distribution of the wealth of the small monastic houses. Chapuis could see that Cromwell had already formed alliances with the Seymour faction, whose daughter Jane had caught the king's eye. Chapuis stirred Cromwell's anger by warning him not to push Queen Anne too far, as she had already advised Cromwell that she wanted his head off his shoulders. A treaty with Charles V was looming, and Chapuis was summoned to court on the 20th of April to consult with the king regarding that treaty. It was here that Chapuis finally acknowledged Anne's status as queen, and bowed to her. He had been well known for never acknowledging her status, and referred to her as the concubine or the whore. Was this a hollow gesture, knowing her impending downfall? Within a matter of a few short weeks, Queen Anne Boleyn was arrested, tried for treason and adultery, found guilty, and had been beheaded. Mary had been lodged at Hudson in Essex during the swift fall of her enemy, and rejoiced at her end. Perhaps now she would be restored to the succession. The events that were to follow would prove that Anne had not been the cause of her suffering, and that Henry had yet to show the lengths that he would take to suppress his daughter. Mary had learnt nothing from Anne's downfall, and would continue her bitter feud with the Boleyns with her sister Elizabeth. The painful events of Mary's childhood formed the notorious Queen of legend, and she maintained that the destruction of her idyllic childhood, her mother, and her church was the work of the concubine, Anne Boleyn.